Zoom. Thank you. And well, first I will introduce myself. I am Eugenia Villatao. I am a junior science officer at the European Science Foundation, and I'm coordinating the implementation of institutional changes at our organization in the frame of the EU-funded GRACE project. I'm also part of other EU-funded projects working on institutional change, in particular in the fields of citizen science and gender equality. So this webinar is part of the 8 final webinars of the GRACE projects that are being held every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Central European time until mid-December. And we will now watch a brief video, if everything works fine, introducing the project, and then we will continue with the presentation of the speakers. So I will now share the good screen.
Over the last 3 years, the GRACE project has worked towards spreading and embedding responsible research and innovation in the European research area. 6 research funding and performing organisations around Europe have been selected to each develop a set of specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-bound grounding actions to achieve institutional change with visible short-term impacts. A selection of these grounding actions has been structured into 8-year roadmaps towards RRI for each organisation, paving the way to attain further and more complex institutional changes in the long run. Grounding actions covered key policies such as ethics, open access, public engagement, gender equality, science education, and governance. What also makes GRACE noteworthy is its approach. 6 expert partners supported the 6 implementing organisations in a co-creative and mutual learning environment. Mutual learning workshops and regular mentoring meetings proved to be an efficient new way of learning. A reflection tool helped implementing organisation to define the vision, goals, and means to implement each action. This tool is available on the project website and can be used by any small group when developing RRI-focused institutional change actions. To ensure effective impact, the project's actions were continuously assessed through a specific evaluation scheme, whereby participants improved their practices by conducting their own evidence-based evaluation in an ongoing process. Find out all about GRACE's RRI actions and tools on our website.
Well, we will share now the link to GRACE project website, so you can see all the things that we have been doing through all these 3 years of the project. Well, the aim of this webinar is to introduce the importance of bottom-up approaches for achieving sustainable institutional changes in responsible research and innovation. Sustainable institutional changes result from a collective effort of both top-down and bottom-up approaches when they are presented and when they are present and when they are coordinated together. This webinar will focus on the bottom-up efforts and will present inspiring practices for the embedment of the responsible research and innovation main keys, and this means the gender equality, open science, science education, research ethics, citizen science or public engagement, and governance, and how to embed them in your research and your institution. So the first presentation will be done by the keynote speaker, Stéphanie Gauthier. Stéphanie is an assistant professor of information systems at Grenoble École de Management. She has worked on EU projects dedicated to RRI, such as Responsible Industry and Satori, and also has participated as a stakeholder in several others, such as RRI tools. Stéphanie is currently the chair of the policy working group of the Marie Curie Alumni Association, where she works and coordinates initiatives aiming at a responsible environment when it comes to research careers. Then we will have a brief presentation of our 2 panelists, Luciano D'Andrea and Vania Palmieri. Luciano is a researcher at Knowledge and Innovation and also a GRACE expert partner. Luciano has been engaged for over 30 years in the domain of sociological research, and over the last decade, his research interests has been mainly focused on science-society relationships, understood as the privileged observation field to analyze the pervasive and profound transformation processes affecting contemporary societies as a whole. He has carried out research projects, consulting activities, training programs, and project evaluation exercises on behalf of several organizations, including the European Commission, European Parliament, the UN Development Programme, among others. And he has been leader and team member in several H2020 and other framework projects. And our second panelist is Vania Palmieri. She's a researcher at the Department of Business and Law in the University of Siena. And she's also a GRACE implementing partner. Vania has a PhD in Business Administration and Management. And from 2019 to June 2020, she held a research fellow issued by the department and linked to the GRACE project. And today she is part of the team that deals with implementation of the activities at the department level, including the roadmap towards RRI. And her commitment has been crucial in triggering the bottom-up processes at the institutional change. Such experience has led her to devote significantly attention to the subject of RRI, which has become part of her topics for research. And well, after the panelists' presentation, we will have some time for panel discussions and also for question and answer. So if at any point you have a question to address to the speakers, please type them on the chat at any moment. And we will leave now the floor to Stéphanie Gauthier. Stéphanie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to set up the presentation. Just give me 30 seconds to do that. Now it should work and you should see the slide full screen. So thank you for having me here. It's always nice, and I must say it's also almost always unexpected for me to have to talk about elements related to RRI, even though I've been doing partially my postdocs on a topic related to this. It's not necessarily from a research perspective a topic that I engage with a lot today. Therefore, I really ask you to consider these thoughts as the thoughts of somebody who is maybe more into thinking about what it means to be doing RRI today in some organizations, and parts of those organizations are the Marie Curie Alumni Association and the Cost Action Project REMO that I'm going to mention to you today. And I'm quite glad to see that you're also mentioning this idea of the bottom-up initiatives. They have to be considered with top-down, because, you know, I said yes when you said, do you want to come and share the experience that you've gathered? And I'm like, sure. And then I was thinking, why did I say yes? I actually don't necessarily believe in pure bottom-up initiatives. So the entire range of things that I'm going to present to you today is really going to be about that we have a lot of dreams of what types of changes I say we would like to do, especially within the Marie Curie Alumni Association, but also every day when you talk to your colleagues, everybody wants to be able to change the research environments. That's something I'm going to focus on today. But we have a lot of big dreams, but we don't necessarily know how to do that change unless sometimes there is some element coming a little bit top down that comes to us and that we can start to use. So I'm going to discuss a little bit of these things with some examples of some projects that are currently running. And I hope that these initiatives, they may inspire you. I also hope to learn from the rest of the conversation, you know, what we could also do maybe a bit differently to try to have more impact. So before I go into those examples, I think it's quite important that we try to set up what we both understand, you and I, as top-down and bottom-up, because actually, to me, it's already something that requires some forms of explanation. So I went with this traditional vision by which we consider that something is top-down when we have an institution, and we should define what that institution actually is going to be, is going to have the power to decide how it's being organized or how the rest of the elements underneath it are going to be organized through some type of flow, through some types of internal rules and regulations. So the institution doesn't have to be the political body. It could be a university that can decide through its rules how things are going to go on and on within its walls. But it is still some vision whereby we have a few people at the top that could decide the way in which our social life within this institution should be organized. Traditionally, as far as I know in the literature, we tend to believe that it's a vision that requires to have a rational view of how things are being organized. So we tend to believe that people at the top, they know how we should be organized in such a way that we can be efficient. So anytime there is a change, it's about trying to rationalize the way in which things are being done. And the change that can be triggered can be a big and a radical change, because people at the top have the authority of deciding how we're supposed to be behaving. So they could decide from one day to the next that everything is going to be changing. That's sometimes what happens with new laws that prevent things to be done, even though they were done before, and so forth and so on. When we talk about bottom-up, or at least in my understanding and in the way in which I'm going to be discussing it in the rest of this presentation, bottom-up is supposed to be something whereby we have social groups, individuals that somewhat manage to gather and share some common visions of what values should be enacted within an institution, of what beliefs, of what desires, of what norms they actually deem to be desirable, and that they would like to see being embedded into their institution. Again, institution could be a university, could be a research group, could be also society overall, anything that we could design like that. When I was looking at some definitions to try to see whether my vision was somewhat, matching with things that we tend to see traditionally, I was a bit puzzled, because I saw in a couple of places that for people, bottom-up approaches are also visions whereby that type of vision emerges spontaneously. And so I put spontaneously in inverted commas, because of course it's kind of spontaneous, because it's more like, maybe you and I, we gather, like me and my peers at the Marie Curie Alumni Association, we realize there's a problem, and we say, well, actually, we want to have responsible research environments, and we can make emerge the meaning of what that responsibility means through our interaction. So in that sense, it's not something that is being planned, and nobody told us, you guys have to go and think about what it means to be a responsible research environment. But at the same time, it's also a bit naive, perhaps, to think that these things are totally spontaneous, because they usually come from previous movements, elements that have been occurring in society. So if we are thinking about responsible research environments today, it's because we have seen more and more problems occurring of breaches of research ethics or integrity, for instance. So it somehow opens up our eyes to that. It could be that there are several movements in society that are not even related to research environments, but they make us think that maybe we need to be a little bit more open-minded. I'm thinking about, Black Lives Matter and all these things that also make people think about diversity when it comes to research. So anyhow, it's not just a group of people that can spontaneously decide about something totally new. It's more like we are marching in the way of orders, and then we try to ascribe meaning depending on those social norms, social values that we see are taking more and more interest, and we try to understand what we can do with that. And ideally, the bottom layer would try to bring these things back to the top layer and try to find some form of middle ground trade-off moment whereby the top layer would realize that these values or these desires are actually becoming important, and they should have a say in the way in which we organize society, so that the bottom-up ambition is being realized. The problem that we have when we're thinking bottom-up is that we typically would like to have some big change, but what I've just said is actually the change is always going to be tied to some elements that are already nearby us, and also elements that sometimes institutions or policymakers are also appropriating already. So we would like to believe that we have, I would say, a monopoly. It's not exactly a monopoly, but we tend to believe that because we are the researchers, we are the representatives, we have a sense of what we would like to get done. We are this bottom layer that needs to be heard, but at the same time, it's also not in our power to do radical change as the top layer could do. And I think it's really important to understand, because it's going to come later, I think, in parts of my slides. But one of the struggles that we actually have is that we are very nice people full of dreams, and we would like radical changes, which actually are never going to happen in that way. So we have to try to operationalize in order to make sure we can reach incremental changes time after time. So maybe that's also part of what we need to think about when we will be thinking about how to lead institutional change. For me, that's a big question about how incremental the change should actually be. But I tend to believe that's where we need to be going. If we just look at this idea of the top-down and the bottom-up, you can see the arrows, they give this sensation that maybe there is just one direction in which it's supposed to go, like either the bottom is talking to the top or vice versa. But generally, when we look at changes in terms of policy, the way things go is that, of course, you have a bottom and a top layer. It's always a bit like that. But the way we can communicate is not so rational. It's not one path. It's that type of mess that's represented on that slide. And I think it's also important to try to consider for a couple of seconds what it means to make decisions when it comes to policy making. Again, you can take it as policy making, your policymakers in your country, but we could also imagine them being in a form of institution, right? So usually they don't take decisions based on a very linear and rational approach. The decisions that end up being taken are just decisions that happen to be somewhere around there at the moment at which we need them. And that's partially what is represented in what we call the garbage can model, which is that you need to have ideas floating around all the time, addressing some forms of topics. Sometimes they will not be taken, so it's like you're judging all the time. And sometimes your idea will be there at the right moment. You never can exactly predict, when is going to be the right moment, because the entire process is a mess. Some things are going to be decided very quickly, some things are not. Some things will be asked from policymakers or your institutions. They will say, we need to reform the way we do research assessment, and you will believe that they will decide that tomorrow, but actually they may decide it only in 2 years because many things are going to happen in between. Sometimes we also try to set up an agenda, but in the end, nobody decides anything based on what has been put inside that agenda. So it makes it really hard when you're the bottom layer, because you don't even know, at what moment are you supposed to try to think about, okay, we have this potential change. This is the way in which we would like to steer it. What do we do? Not so clear. And then that again is a problem for us, at least in the Marie Curie Alumni Association, because for a very long time, we had lots of members that believed that policy was about reacting to the decisions that had been taken, which partially is the case, because if a decision has been taken, you can highlight the loss, you can highlight the maybe not so good trade-offs, and maybe you can start to build for the next incremental change, but that's not the only thing that you can do. And I think it's also quite important that we realize this when we want to steer bottom-up change. We can try to set the agenda, we can try to enlighten the other layers about some elements. It can be that there are some values that are not understood. It can be that they have some definitions of some problems that actually are biasing their solutions toward one angle, and you would like to show to them that in reality, there are also other definitions that are possible. That's what we call the enlightenment model. You can also try to use the process to try to be given a voice as some form of stakeholder. The problem is at that stage that you need to be recognized as a stakeholder. And then we can have a bit of the debate about, whether or not every individual can be taken as a stakeholder, whether it's about representative institutions. So then it's institutions trying to influence other institutions, which again, for me is always a bit in between that type of bottom-up or top-down approach. So what I mean to say is that it's not so easy as just to say the policymakers or the institutions have decided something, or we as a bottom layer have tried to push for something. We all already in that process, we can see how much it can be intricated. So we're all always kind of working together. So in a way, can we really think that it can be going only in what direction? I don't necessarily believe so. As much as we have that, we also have now this idea of, RRI, which is a great concept, but that a lot of people have been talking about, at least around me, as some form of magical wand. So it's like suddenly, because we want to participate, we would like to do some bottom-up change, right? We want to be heard and so forth and so on. So we go and we say, well, everything has to be done, according to the 6 keys of RRI. And so, of course, then we have to be able to participate, which is not totally wrong because, as RRI is talking about ethics, other forms of governance, public engagement, it also requires that stakeholders actually can be heard and are given a place that would be equal to the place of some other actors that could participate, let's say, in the change. There's also the notion of diversity. So for me, it's not about only gender. It's something that has to be about diversity in general, so diversity of representations. So in a way, we also have a role to play when we are there. But then saying that we are trying to do something following the RRI keys also opens up a new problem, which is you can be asked from institutions, to participate. They can even try to give you some means in order to start doing something. But are you ever sure that you're really properly being heard? Is sitting at a table enough to be thinking that you're taking part on the governance of some topic? Or are you supposed to be able to vote? Because that's always a big topic that we have as well when we're considering initiatives from the EU when it comes to responsible research environments or responsible research careers. So for me, it's not exactly so clear. And then I see not necessarily a danger because I think it's a great enabler, but I think that we need to be a bit mindful about what we want to take from this notion of RRI and what could help us in trying to build maybe better bottom-up initiatives. So ideally, there is still some work to do about engaging with stakeholders and what it means to truly engage. Probably there is also some work that needs to be done about the different modes of governance when it comes to steering change in institutions with the bottom layer. So I'm not necessarily, as I told you, up to date on where you have advanced the literature on those elements. So I look forward to seeing what is being done in that area. But for us, these have been questions and moments that can really stop us from being able to have an impact. So how do we do to be recognized as stakeholders, to be heard, and then to have a voice in the decisions that are going to be taken? Because we are rarely very patient when it comes to trying to understand, what could we do with our bottom-up approaches. So we want this radical change that I've mentioned. We also want to try to participate in the governance, as I've just said, but by doing so, we also institutionalize ourselves, which also means that then we have maybe not necessarily a lack of legitimacy because we are an institution, but it raises additional issues. Very often, we tend to believe that the stakeholder knows better, either because it has the empirical experience or for us, sometimes the scientific evidence alone, but it's not going to be enough to actually be able to say how decisions should be taken. And we also want to have bottom-up actions, but sometimes, we are not seen as representative. So I think these are quite important issues. And then sometimes we also want to make changes in institutions without engaging with them so much. Or we forget that also institutions are made by individuals that also have their own values and so on. So I think it's quite difficult sometimes to understand where is the entrance. So we're trying to think about these things in several ways. One of the first modes of actions that we are having is to try to always be in communication with what we will call the top layer, our institutions, to try to push those messages, as I was telling you earlier, a little bit with this garbage can model, trying to say things in which we believe, to represent and give a voice to the different types of researchers that we would be representing. So this summer, the Swiss National Foundation invited me to take part in a panel with Jean-Pierre Bourguignon, who was back then the interim president of the ERC. And they wanted to talk about the challenges that researchers were facing because of COVID. So we're there, everybody's talking about, how it has been hard for women, which I absolutely not going to challenge. It's been really hard for women especially, but it's been hard for a series of other researchers, including young researchers, for many different reasons. I'm not going to get into detail. Very nice moment to try to discuss with those people who actually are at the top, because they are making the rules, they are setting up the criteria, the idea of performance that we have, which definitely falls into our idea of responsible research. And a couple of months later, quite interestingly, at the moment where he was not the interim president of the ERC anymore, Jean-Pierre Bourguignon started to actually pick up on elements that were also part of what I wanted to tell him, which was we need to be careful because there is a young generation, not only of women, but that has suffered for X and Y reason. And we need to take that into consideration when we're going to assess them. Obviously, I cannot say that I'm the one who put that in his head. It's probably something that he has heard quite many times and somehow it came up. But, you know, that's also one of the difficulties of our bottom-up initiatives and the messages or the changes that we would like to make. Sometimes it's really hard to make a direct link between what we have done and what the change is going to end up being like. So we try to do things like that. We try to remain available anytime when the institutions are calling us. So lately it has been the Commission and the DGRTD because they were working on this publication of yesterday about the reform of the research assessment system. So we were part with many other organizations of the stakeholders that actually had a chance to see a preview of the document and give their own feedback. So again, I can't really say that this is a bottom-up initiative, but at the same time, we've been working on research assessment for quite a long time, publishing manifestos, different forms of declarations to shed light on the problem. And now we're given this opportunity by the top layer to try to work on it. So it's quite an interesting way of working. We also try to institutionalize our actions, or try to structure them, I would say, maybe more than institutionalize. So we've been working on researchers' mental health, and to do that, we have actually structured it through a cost action that's funded again by the EU, which is called REMO. And the idea of REMO is really to try to bring the topic to the agenda. At the same time, we already have the support of the funding system and some interest from the EU because they have picked the project, which always opens a couple of doors. But we also try to make sure that we have different levels being represented. So what the project aims at doing is really to build an evidence hub to show that there is a problem when it comes to researcher mental health and try to identify the best practices so that we could develop some institutional policies to try to prevent mental health issues or to try to deal with them better. We also are going to try to train individuals. We are organized in a way where we have 3 different layers: the policy layer, the institutional layer, and the individual layer. And every time we're trying to have different forms of stakeholders that are part of the network, which I think is an interesting way in which we can work, because we are always deciding together of what should be our impact, our shared outcomes, our actions, our values, that we then, in a way, presented in the manifesto to be able to have anyone who wants to come with us. So for the moment, we can't really say that there has been a lot of change related to REMO because it's been only a year. So that's another dimension, the dimension of time. But we would like to hope that because of the interest that this topic is receiving and because of the interest that we are getting from people across the union, we're able to reach a critical mass that can then exactly steer some form of change. So that to us is really important. But again, and it's also something that has been mentioned a bit earlier, we can never really do that type of change alone. So it has to be a type of collective work to be able to climb up the mountain. And that's also something that we see in most of the projects that either we're participating or we have followed. On the slide, you have some text that is taken from the Plan S website. So Plan S, open access and everything. I suppose most of you are familiar with Plan S already. What's interesting with the history of Plan S is that it starts as something that is really bottom-up, with a lot of institutions signing the declaration on open access in 2003, but then reaching a bit of a bottleneck because, you know, the principles are not exactly applied. So in order to make Plan S a reality, there has had to be some form of top-down initiative to try to make sure that indeed the principles related to open access could become something I would say mainstream and give more force to what has been going on in the bottom-up layer. So that's quite interesting to see that we need that type of intervention. And it's a model that seems to be generalizing. So again, in the publication of yesterday on research assessment, the Commission is actually suggesting that there would be a form of coalition that would be created. So institutions would sign some form of agreement based on the principles that they outline in the report in order to start to work together on these things. So in a way, it's not exactly bottom up, but it has been a topic that we have been pushing for quite a long time. It's not formalized by this top-down layer to try to actually enable the bottom-up layer to actually appropriate the change. So we could discuss how interesting that is as a mode of functioning, also in terms of the responsibility and the liability and political liability that is going to be associated with the implementation of such coalitions, because then the responsibility falls onto the people who have signed the agreements more than on the policymaker or the institution itself. So I think that more than ever, we need to be thinking about how all these layers meet. We need to think critically about the limitations of those systems, but we need to really make sure that we work on understanding how this bottom up and top down, they can work together instead of necessarily opposing them. So let's try to hope that with all this work, we are able to understand how we can trigger change and an impactful change that can be taken up quite easily. So that's what I wanted to propose to you. I don't know if there are questions already at this stage. Otherwise, we can take them later and discuss with the rest of the panelists. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Very interesting presentation. And yes, the Marie Curie Alumni Association has this key role to channel the voices of all the early career researchers, and also to promote this responsible research at the EU level, which is very important. So yeah, so if you have questions for Stephanie, please, you can write them on the chat and we can get back to them afterwards. Now we will give the floor to Luciano D'Andrea. Luciano? Yeah.
Yes, I'm here. Don't worry, I didn't disappear. I try to share my screen now, and okay. I don't know that you are able to see it.
Yes.
Unfortunately, I know that there is a problem in shifting to the presentation mode, so I'm sorry I try to present in this way. I'm sorry for everyone. Well, my presentation concerns the bottom-up approach in RRI-oriented institutional change. So very rapidly, Stephanie already presented the distinction between the classical distinction between top-down and bottom-up. Very rapidly, we can say that they are considered usually two different management styles. They differ about who gives the input of a change, who defines and interpret the initial situation, define the goals and tasks, define who is involved and who is not in the process of change, who controls the process of change, who evaluates it. So usually top-down approaches see all these elements mainly informed by the leaders and adapted in the ongoing process of change with the participation and involvement of the staff. Or the opposite approach, the bottom-up approaches, see all these elements mainly informed by the staff and adapted by the leaders. Obviously, these are two different idle types. As Stephanie already showed, this is not the real world. In the real world, things happen in different way. Another point I would like to stress that in the shift from modernity to late modernity, that is the last 6-7 decades, we have also a shift in how organization usually works. In the modernity setting, organization were conceived and managed as a top-down, highly hierarchical and formalized structures. While starting from already in the 80s, for example, scholars and managers start perceiving that organization works in a different way, that is multipolar and more flexible structures, where staff mobilization and leadership staff cooperation and interaction were becoming more and more important. So the same concept of change and how change, of course, changed, because in the modernity setting, change was taught and practiced as following the planned pathways. That is the idea that leaders decide and the staff implements, while in late modernity, change is more and more conceived as a result of a multi-directional and partially unforeseeable pathway. That is, change can originate from any part of the organization. Staff involvement becomes so, the consensus of the staff becomes pivotal. These entail that at least in the last decades, bottom-up approach have been getting momentum in many contexts and for pursuing different objectives, not only in the organization. As for institutional change, what is this? Obviously, change always occur. Institutional change could be considered as a particular kind of change that is characterized at least by four features. The first one is the reversibility. That is, institutional changes are rooted in institutions so that they cannot be reversed, for example, by simple leadership or turnover or budget cuts. Secondly is the comprehensiveness. That is, institutional change should involve not only the level of the rules, the formal level, but they necessarily involve many aspects of the organization, including daily practices, cultural and cognitive attitudes of staff or leaders or different parts of the organization, languages, communication patterns, and so forth. The third point is that institutional change is extensive, concern sooner or later large part of the organization, many stakeholders. Is not specific on the specific, for example, organizational unit. And the fourth one is contextualization. Institutional change can work only if specifically they are specifically tailored to the concerned institutional unit. Therefore, when we consider RRI institutional change can be generally can be defined as a reversible, comprehensive, extended, contextualized change, aimed at introducing the very well-known now RRI keys, gender equality, open access, public engagement, etc., and the so-called RRI dimension, the organizational mechanisms like self-reflexivity, inclusivity, responsiveness, and anticipation. That is, I can say, the formal presentation of RRI. Obviously, because of both the contents of RRI and mechanisms of RRI, it's practically impossible to introduce change without a bottom-up component. It's quite obvious that it's paradoxical to introduce, for example, public engagement adopting top-down approaches or inclusiveness adopting top-down approaches. So it's meaningless. So in a certain sense, a component of bottom-up is everywhere. I have to reduce perhaps this. Okay, I have some considerations now from now to the end of the presentation about the experience I carried out about RRI-oriented institutional changes. It's a personal point of view, obviously. But the first consideration that is bottom-up approaches are not unstructured and not spontaneous. That is, the idea usually is that top-down approaches are structured and planned, while bottom-up approaches are unstructured and spontaneous. While in my experience, I see that promoting bottom-up approach requires specific structure that you have to create, for example, dialogue structures or other kind of forms of interaction, awareness-raising activities, and so forth, and especially require plans. That is, we need to define a process of change, how to trigger it, how to develop it, how to make it sustainable. The second point is bottom-up approaches require an understanding of the stakeholders' motivation to get involved, because the idea is usually, I saw, that if you open the doors of the institution, people participate. That is not true, or is not true always. Staff and more in general people does not participate in the process of change only because participation is allowed or is required or is asked. So the problem is understanding the reason why people get engaged. And mobilization is a hard job, really, for those who are in charge of mobilizing orders. So understanding the variety of motivation that different stakeholders have to participate in a given process is pivotal, as well as to create new motivations, urging people to participate. Third point, bottom-up approach require transformational agents. That is precisely because bottom-up processes are not spontaneous, and staff and people usually not automatically get involved. This means that there is the need for someone able to mobilize the other people. So we can refer to them as transformational agents. That is someone, a team, an informal group, a champions, an officer, whoever, which are the capacity and motivation to trigger the process, to mobilize the other stakeholders, to channel to the involvement of the energy produced by the stakeholder towards desirable objectives. Fourth point is that bottom-up approach requires negotiation. Negotiation means that you need to create places where an institutional context allow people to and to different voices to converge toward a common ground, common interpretation of the situation, and this is an interpretive level, but also to understand the relevance of, in this case, RRI. That is, there is also a symbolic level of negotiation, how RRI can be attractive for different stakeholders, for example. There is obviously a normative level, that is how to solve the problems and how to promote RRI, how to promote gender equality in terms of regulation, norms, procedures, etc. And there will be also negotiation about the practices, the daily practices that people use in their daily activities. These are part of RRI institutional change. Negotiation, I believe, is quite the core of the problem. So for each level, for each kind of negotiation, specific strategies and specific tools should be devised. 5, bottom-up approach are not always the best ones to use. That is, for some action, for specific situation, in given context, adopting a tendentially, because there is no pure top-down approach, but a top-down approach could be more appropriate at the beginning, for example. So it is important to select the best approach to use. 6th, bottom-up approach require an acceptable level of trust and transparency. This is obvious. The results of bottom-up approach can be different than expected. So you have to accept the results of the process. Bottom-up approaches may rise resistances, may rise conflicts, and this aspect cannot be managed without an acceptable level of trust, confidence among the different actors involved. 7, bottom-up approach should consider structural constraints. I believe that RRI cannot change everything. More often, what is possible to modify a little bit what is happening in existing structures. You can modify some regulation, you can change some arrangement, you can practices, some change introducing some new practices or new tasks. I don't believe that RRI is aimed at doing new things totally, but is focusing on doing ordinary things in the new ways. But you have to start from the existing practices, the existing regulation, the existing mindset of people, etc. And the objective is introducing seeds of change that will grow over time in an evolutionary perspective. Therefore, any bottom-up approach should start from the existing possibility, take into consideration the constraints that are there, to change, and should consider existing structural constraints, what is possible and what is not. Otherwise, is really ephemeral. And the last point, we have to consider that there is a dynamic in the institutional change. It develops by phases. Even though institutional change occur each time in partially unpredictable ways, anyhow, we should be able to recognize the different dynamics at the different phases. By experience, I see that there is a very difficult triggering phase in which someone starts introducing some process, something new. That could be spontaneous or not, but the first step is establishing a group of people, establishing someone able to serve as a transformational agent. Then there is the problem of mobilizing the others, the stakeholders, and this, for example, for raising the problem to deal with, creating an arising awareness process, of for interpreting the situation. For example, usually any RRI-oriented institutional change process start with a diagnosis of the situation of the organization. Then there is a sort of a spiral-shaped process in which the new things are impacting of the existing things. And that is the much more critical point, because you have to define solution, you have to select in solution, you have defined the priorities, and the solutions start to be implemented. So you need exchange, you need decision-making process, you need coordination, and the different layers of the organization should cooperate or should interact anyhow in that point. And finally, there is also the problem to ensuring sustainability of the action initiated before through an institutionalization process, finding institutional arrangements. For each phase, the most appropriate bottom-up strategies, and even top-down strategies, or both coordinated bottom-up and top-down strategies should be devices. And this means also be able, as far as possible, to react to the new situation and to be ready to modify our plans, our approaches when necessary. So this is my considerations about how to apply, or what it means applying bottom-up approach in the context of the promotion of RRI-oriented actions. And that's it's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Luciano. Thank you for this short history of the change, how change is changing through the last years, and also this list of different considerations. I think it's very important, especially for institutions that are starting now, institutional changes, to know this, to know already the process and what you can have and how you can deal with the different negotiations and choosing the right battles. It's very important, especially because institutional changes, as you were saying, and as Stephanie was saying too, from the bottom you want to do this radical change, and of course it's not that easy, and you might get a lot of frustration and anxiety at the beginning. So knowing the process helps you to cope with that. So I don't know if you have any questions. For me, what was resonating after Stephanie's presentation was how is this encounter of top-down and bottom-up approaches, especially as you mentioned, there are only few times where this is very smoothly. Let's say, like, because top-down and bottom-up, normally they have different priorities. In the cases that they have the same priority, this is kind of synergistically, and it will happen and it will be smoothly done. But this is not the majority of the cases. I think the majority of the cases is just the opposite, and that's why you could see your image of really like complicated process. So my question would be, what to do then? If from the bottom up perspective. So, because as you were mentioning, you would, as being a researcher, you would like these changes to happen And of course, you think they are important, so you would like to happen now. So my question would be how to do this happening? What are the strategies of making it happen at the end, or what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I don't know, because I think when we're thinking about that type of change, it's not going to happen overnight. Also, because as I was saying, if I'm thinking about responsible research environments, I have to think about a multiplicity of actors. I also have to think about a multiplicity of contexts. And that's also something that Luciano was mentioning, the idea that it had to be fit to context. And I was also very happy when I saw, Luciano, your thoughts about this idea of having to be structured. So it's not that spontaneous as a form of change, because I also believe that that's part of the answer to your question, Eugenia, which is probably one of the ways is to try to structure in such a way in which you can be in contact, or at least in touch with what your top layer is thinking about or has as some form of considerations, so that you're never totally out of touch. The problem when we do that, or at least I think the critical moment that we have, even I'm smiling because I think it's something that we even discussed between ourselves for the NCAA, which is the problem when you start to talk too much to the top layer is that you end up being contaminated by what they are thinking, and you end up being actually, or seeing yourself as maybe becoming their agent, and then you lose that nature of the bottom up. So it's not because we represent to some degree early career researchers or Marie Curie fellows that we can just take those topics that come from the top. We always have to find that balance between trying to influence with our bottom-up beliefs, initiatives, values, what they might be presenting to us, because that's also what's going to be helping them. So I think it's a win-win. It's not to be annoying, it's just the way things should be. But at the same time, we need to keep our true nature and essence as a form of bubbling group where, you know, some new topics can keep on emerging, and we have to find a way to bring this up. And they require different skills, which is not always easy to find in one person or two persons, whatever you can structure yourself. So I guess that's where it's partially a way in which we can think as to how to structure. So those different modes of communications is structure about different actions that we're going to undertake. So for us, it's the task forces, and they change over time. But I don't know what's the best way for them to work, because again, it depends on so many things outside of what we can do. So my response to you has to be a bit limited, but really I think it's there's a lot in what Luciano was saying that's also addressing your question.
Yeah. Luciano, would you like to add something about this?
Well, the first point that there could be also a mismatch between at the bottom level. That is, that is not necessarily people at the bottom think the same, have the same expectation, the same things, and so forth. So negotiation already start at the bottom level, because people can disagree about what are the next steps to take, and so forth. And the second point I can say is that the first step is really, I believe that negotiation is a key word, but it could be really rhetoric. So it's risky to use the concept of negotiation. But negotiation means, firstly, understanding that there are other opinions and there are other views to see. And that is sometimes is a discovery. Because when you don't speak about the problems, understanding there are different positions, probably you think that the other thinks something that is not true. So I believe that avoiding any kind of rhetoric of a communitarism approach, and assembly, and so forth, but I believe that it's a real thing that negotiations are part of how organization now works. So the problem is understanding which are the main structure, the main strategies, the main the best tools to do that. But I believe that the key point is starting from a real negotiation process, and then see what happens, because not everything can be planned. But just having a map of the different standpoints could be very useful.
Yeah. So to start like developing
because
a draft of a strategy of how to do it.
Understanding what is hidden is not explicit.
So we have a question of Illy Poli, that she's the coordinator of Grace project. Yeah, Illy.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eugenia. Very interesting talks. Thank you very much all. It's not so much a question as a comment. So I like very much this word negotiation, and of course we see the value of it. But I think people that dedicate themselves to lead bottom-up approaches, they should not be discouraged anytime by feeling disruptive forces and disturb. And this is also, and then the negotiation might also be, like a next step in the process. But I think those that actually dedicate themselves, there will be moments when they really feel that they are disturbing and they are making a confusion. And it should not be ever treated as a pulling back force. That's my comment only. I mean, it may bring very difficult moments and psychologically heavy situations, but I think that's also a physiological process that leads to effective and efficient negotiations.
Yeah, thank you very much, Illy. Yeah, especially talking about mental health as the remote cost. This is very important for doing institutional changes. Yes, Stephanie, you would like to?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, I agree, negotiation is important. At the same time, I'm not necessarily put it at the first, at the top of my mind. What I think is more necessary when we start is this idea of mapping out first, who are those other stakeholders that may belong to the same, let's say, bottom layer as you do, and understanding what they think, because it's really hard to do bottom-up change when you do it on your own. So trying to figure out who could be your allies. And then, of course, if those other groups or, don't necessarily align with you, then I guess that's the moment when you start to not necessarily negotiate, but try to figure out a way, a little bit like the politicians they do, to try to understand what could be the trade-off, to try to maybe group with them. And I guess that trade-off can be also called some form of negotiation, just so that maybe you're going to have a more incremental change than what you believed in the first place, but still you'll be able to do something while you still try to build the rest of your argument, because usually we don't forget what we wanted in the first place, and try to figure out another way to push it further. And I think Luciano also mentioned that this idea of mapping. And sometimes it's really hard. And I think that's one of the difficulties. It's not necessary to find the top layers, because usually we know who we have to talk to. It's more about understanding who else could be on the same bandwagon to try to make sure that we could have more impact.
Yeah, and as Luciana was saying, also to identify these change agents that might be perfect allies for this. And so Illy, you would like to mention something else? No, this is old one. Okay, good. Okay, so I don't know if someone else has questions on the audience. No.
Well, I can pick up on your remark on mental health.
Yes.
Because it's always a complicated topic, because it has a lot of stigma, right? So it's not so easy to bring it up. But at the same time, to be frankly honest, mental health nowadays is not a big thing to actually bring up, because we have some starting point of evidence. So what changed everything about the way in which we can discuss mental health and the way it should be taken into consideration in research environments seems to be related to the 2017 Levesque study in Europe. So Katia Levesque and her colleagues in Belgium, they've made these huge surveys of PhD students where they could actually finally show real numbers of this is whatever 50% of the PhD students are at risk of a mental health disorder, and 38% of researchers actually suffer from mental health disorders versus 19% of the population. So it's one study, but it's one study that appears as a starting point. It's not a study that is enough in itself to try to solve the problem, but it goes to saying, sometimes with one element, then you can start to shed light on a topic. So that's nice because it comes from our own interest as a researcher. I would imagine as well our own professional ethics as to how she wanted the PhD students to be treated around her. But again, it's not because as researchers we have one study that we can solve everything. So one of the first tasks of REMO is to build this huge evidence hub, because typically when you want to influence the institutions, and here I directly mean the policymakers, they will want to have more than one result. So they will want to have that type of metadata, meta-analysis of several papers to try to show to them that indeed there is something in there. So I don't think that bottom-up change always has to go through that way. But when we're looking at such topics, I think it can make a difference. So other controversial topics, I don't necessarily have a strong experience with them, but mental health nowadays has become something easy to talk about, partially because of this. So it's easier to just show that it's not a group of people who are in the view of some total psychos or something. No, it's just it's a normal topic, and it's something that we have to consider because it's all around us. So that can also sometimes be a type of evidence or proof.
Yeah, again, the mapping in this case not of the stakeholders and change agents, but of existing problems, issues, like showing the problem. And also what Luciano was mentioning in his presentation, to build the importance of building on existing data, of course, but on existing also initiatives that maybe facilitates the work. So even for engaging, I don't know, if you're in a research institution, you can become staff representative or go and talk with them and here get more allies and more people to support to you.
I would like to add a little things about the question of mental health. It's very interesting.
Yes.
Because one of the things that is strange to me is that the RRI do not consider the conditions of students and PhD as part of its mandate. Because if you consider the situation of usually said it's called neoliberal university or something like that, every actors working now in the university and the research settings experience a very highly competitive environment, making problems of any kind with ethical also I mean consequences that are not considered as part of RRI mandate. For example, I remember that there is a huge amount of students, PhD students, that are overexploited during 10 years of their life to be expelled from the system because they are not permanent places, not permanent job for them. So I believe that we have also contextualized RRI in order to understand how it can work, because it's very nice to have a public engagement with the citizen, etc. But if you have overstressed researchers striving for their future, especially when they are young, it's very difficult to set up an RRI, public engagement oriented, or if you think, for example, in the last sentence I say, gender equality, when you have, you live in a world where mobility is one of the main assets you can aspire to. And that is staged because it's something that penalizes more women than men. That is an aspect that RRI should consider, but strangely is not considered as part of RRI effort. So I believe that we have also enlarged a little bit the boundaries of RRI, also consider the real condition of people working inside research organization in this transformation period. So this is part of a mental health problem, because mental health is not something emerging from nothing, but it's something emerging from a given context, overstressing context of competition.
Yeah, totally agree.
Sorry, Eugenia.
Yes, Vania.
Can I add something to Stephanie?
Yes, please.
It is just a curiosity, of course, but I would like to know if you, Stephanie, on the basis of your experience or of your knowledge, think that there are some scientific disciplines with reference to which it is harder to have a kind of bottom-up approach and engaging public in a bottom-up approach, participating then to policy or whatever. Do you think that there are some scientific disciplines for which it is harder to do something like this?
No, I don't think so. The reason for that being that I come originally from political science, so then that's a different topic. I did my PhD in information systems. I did my first postdoc in philosophy, and the first postdoc that I was given was actually to try to understand how we can do responsible research and innovation, or how could we stimulate change in policy and in industry. So I think that if even philosophers come up with those questions, and we tend to believe that they are quite removed from that type of considerations, then I tend to believe that anyone can do that. The harder sciences, if you want, I think that they have other advantages, being, the type of evidence that they can collect. So philosophical evidence is really not the same as, if you're going to run your study in medicine or biology or something. So I think, that there you have numbers that in a way can speak. Of course, they're constructed in some way, but generally they're well taken. So I'd like to believe, and maybe it's my naive perspective, but based on my own experience, I believe that if people really want to try to instill some change with what they have around them, they usually can start. But maybe it's, I don't know if your experience is different, Vanya, or...
No. In my experience, it was a positive one. I mean, I'm part of a department of business and law, and we managed to include in some way the public in our research. But I was just wondering if for some others it would have been difficult.
I think it's a question of mindset more than anything, So for some disciplines, maybe also it's easier. Like I'm thinking about my colleagues in organizational psychology, who are actually very instrumental when we're thinking about the changes we need to do in terms of mental health, because they consider the organizations differently than what probably you and I would do. So some disciplines, they have an edge. Maybe some disciplines, they have topics that are closer to the public. So if you are doing physics, like some people are doing here in Grenoble with the synchrotron, and they just like have those particles going super fast, super nice for them, but sometimes the application can be quite remote. So I guess that for them, there are some difficulties maybe as to understanding what am I supposed to tell to the public. But they need to abstract from that, because we anyway all have our own research ethics and behaviors in labs and behaviors in so many things. So if they want to, I think they can have something to talk about. It's a matter of of choice, And coming back to what Luciano was saying about mental health, the need of context is definitely there. And I think one of the good things about the cost actions is that they enable you to have representatives in several countries, but they also in a way give some boundaries. You can work with people outside of the EU, but you actually have to focus on what's happening in the countries that are eligible to be part of the cost action, which is already quite many for us, to try to understand exactly what is going on in there, because the situation between the newly integrated countries and the other countries is not the same, not even when it comes to competition. Even if I would compare the French and the Italian system, they would be already totally different, right? So they lead to different forms of problems within. So what we wanted to do, and I think it comes also to a comment of Eugenia earlier, is that now we're working on building a network of ambassadors. So we want to find in the different countries, these peoples that can be not necessarily just like representatives, but who can feel like having a mandate and who can actually relate to us what is happening at their own contextual level, to try to make sure that what we end up advocating for is actually going to serve their needs. And we hope, and we are still defining what those ambassadors are going to end up doing, but that it can enable some form of also local change. So it's okay if the change is not totally global. We dream big, but we're quite realistic, but at least we try to figure out these ambassadors of changes, if you want, who they can be and what they could be doing.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Stephanie, Luciano, and Vanya. So now I think it's time to conclude the webinar. It was very nice discussion, and also very nice to merge the mental health and well-being as part like overarching of all RRI keys. Maybe it's a good idea we can give to the commission. Well, thank you very much again, and thank you all the participants for being here. And as my colleague Colette mentioned, the recordings will be available at the website of GRACE. And I would like to invite you all to our next final webinar that is next Tuesday at 2 p.m. again. And this one would be about ethics and data protection in humanities research. So it's very interesting topic, and you are all invited to register. Well, thank you very much and have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.